The chained Apache woman begged, "Do what you want," but he made an unexpected decision. Birds circled high above, their shadows stretching across the dry earth, and the wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. A small group of Apache warriors had been moving cautiously through the desert, alert to every sound, every rustle of leaves, every crack of twigs underfoot. Among them was a young Apache woman, known for her quiet bravery and sharp mind. Her name had been spoken in whispers among her people, not out of fear, but out of admiration. She had survived dangers that had humbled even the most seasoned hunters, and her courage had become a symbol of hope for her tribe. On this morning, however, hope seemed distant. The group had been moving near a canyon when the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. The Apache had long known the risk of encountering settlers or soldiers, but the frequency of such encounters had increased in recent months. A small patrol of soldiers had been sent to quell any resistance in the area, and they were closing in with a speed that suggested careful planning. The young woman's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her movements calm and deliberate, signaling to her companions to scatter quietly. The ambush came suddenly. The sound of gunfire and shouts echoed through the canyon, startling the birds into flight and sending dust swirling in the air. The Apache warriors tried to respond, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. One by one, they were pushed back, and the young woman found herself separated from her friends. Panic threatened to take hold, but she forced herself to stay alert. She ran toward a narrow crevice, hoping to find cover, but a soldier appeared in her path. His eyes were sharp, and his expression was one of determination. Before she could react, she felt the cold metal of handcuffs close around her wrists, binding her tightly. She struggled, but the chains held firm. The soldier gave a curt nod, signaling his comrades to secure the others. She looked around, scanning the rocky terrain for any chance of escape, but it was clear that the ambush had been perfectly planned. She was now a prisoner, and her heart sank as she realized the gravity of her situation. Despite this, she lifted her chin and met the soldier's gaze. Fear was there, of course, but so was defiance. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The journey to the nearby fort was long and grueling. The sun rose higher, beating down on the narrow paths through the desert. Her hands were raw from the chains, and every step she took was a reminder of her captivity. Yet she remained composed, observing the soldiers silently. She noticed their uniforms, the way they spoke to one another, the strictness in their movements. She realized that she was now in a world very different from her own, a world governed by rules she did not understand and power she could not match. When they finally reached the fort, the officer in charge, a man whose reputation for discipline preceded him, approached. He was tall and stern-looking, with eyes that seemed to measure everything in sight. The young woman's heart raced as he studied her, and for a moment she feared that he would act harshly, as many had in similar situations. Yet there was something different in the way he looked at her. He did not see just a prisoner. He seemed to be assessing her as a person, trying to understand her, perhaps even weighing her courage against his own sense of duty. She was led to a small, dimly lit cell. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of stone and metal. The chains clinked as she moved, and she sat down, trying to steady her breathing. Memories of her tribe, her family, and the life she had known flooded her mind. She thought of the stories her grandmother had told her, stories of survival, of clever escapes, of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. She reminded herself that she was not powerless. Even in this situation, there was a chance to assert herself, to show strength in the only way she could. The officer entered the cell shortly after, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he observed her, taking in her posture, her expression, the subtle ways she held herself despite the chains. There was a long silence, and in that silence, she felt a strange connection forming. She realized that he was curious about her, that he did not see her merely as an enemy or a captive, but as someone who had lived a life entirely different from his own. She wondered what he was thinking, what he might decide to do next. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm but firm, carrying authority without cruelty. He asked her name, and she answered without hesitation. He asked about her tribe, her life, and the world she came from. She spoke cautiously, knowing that her words could be used against her, but also aware that there was an opportunity to make him understand that she was more than a prisoner. She described the land, the people, and the values that guided her community. She spoke of courage, of loyalty, of survival, and in doing so she planted a seed of respect in the officer's mind. Hours passed, and the officer left and returned several times, each time asking more questions, each time observing her more closely. She noticed small gestures, a nod, a pause, a careful choice of words, that suggested he was reconsidering the usual rules of engagement. She realized that he was not like the others she had encountered, that he was capable of seeing her humanity even in a situation designed to strip her of it. Despite the chains, despite the fear, she began to feel a cautious hope. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the fort, she remained seated, chains heavy on her wrists, yet her spirit unbroken. She understood that her life hung in the balance, and that every word, every glance, every moment mattered. She was determined to remain true to herself, to hold on to her dignity even in captivity. And as the night approached, she sensed that the story was far from over, that the officer's decision, whatever it might be, could change the course of her life in ways she could not yet imagine. In that moment, the young Apache woman realized something profound. Life, even when constrained by chains and circumstance, still held possibilities. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. And as she sat in the quiet of her cell, listening to the distant sounds of the fort settling into night, she knew that her journey had only just begun. Whatever awaited her, she would face it with the same courage that had guided her through countless trials before. The desert had tested her, her people had shaped her, and now, in the unlikeliest of places, she would test the limits of compassion and human choice itself. The first night in the fort was long and quiet, though the young Apache woman could hear the distant echoes of footsteps and low conversations from the guards outside her cell. She lay on the hard floor, her wrists still sore from the chains, and tried to make sense of the day's events. The fear that had gripped her earlier had not fully disappeared, but it had changed. Now it was mixed with curiosity. Who was this officer who had looked at her differently, who seemed to measure her not as a prisoner but as a person? She could not stop wondering what he might do next. Morning arrived slowly. A pale light seeped through the small window in her cell, illuminating the rough stone walls. The young woman stretched her stiff arms and listened carefully, trying to catch any sign of movement. Soon, the familiar sound of footsteps approached, deliberate and controlled. It was the officer. He carried a small notebook and a pencil, and he did not immediately speak. Instead, he sat down a short distance away and studied her with careful attention. His presence was firm but not threatening, and for the first time since her capture she felt a spark of trust. "Tell me about your people," he said quietly. "What is life like in your village?" The young woman hesitated for a moment. She had been taught to be cautious, especially around strangers who might use her words against her. But there was something in his tone, a patience, a curiosity that did not demand obedience, that made her speak. She began by describing the land where she had grown up, the wide valleys, the rivers that sparkled in the sun, and the mountains that rose like guardians around her village. She spoke of the seasons, the animals, and the ways her people lived in harmony with nature. As she spoke, the officer listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes in his book. He asked questions not to trap her but to understand. "How do your people celebrate?" he asked. "What do you teach your children?" She described the dances, the songs, and the stories passed down from elders. She spoke of lessons in courage, loyalty, and respect for the land and its creatures. She spoke of her mother, who had taught her to be clever and brave, and her grandmother, whose stories had inspired her to never give up, even in the face of danger. The officer's eyes did not leave her face. He seemed to be listening not just to her words, but to the feeling behind them, the pride and love she had for her people. Hours passed in this quiet exchange. The young woman began to notice small things about the officer. He did not carry the anger or fear she had expected from someone in his position. He did not shout, and he did not make threats. Instead, he asked, he observed, and he waited. She realized that he was trying to understand her as a person, not just as a prisoner. And in that realization, a strange sense of relief settled over her. She was still bound by chains, but her spirit felt a little freer. Over the next few days, the routine continued. The officer would visit her cell several times a day. Sometimes he brought water or a small piece of bread, and other times he simply sat and listened. They spoke of many things: the history of her people, the struggles she had faced, the dreams she held for the future. She could sense that he was forming his own thoughts, that he was weighing options and considering decisions beyond what his superiors might expect. During one visit, the officer asked her about courage. "You are brave," he said. "Most people would break under fear. Yet you face it every day. How do you do it?" The young woman paused, thinking carefully. "Courage is not about being unafraid," she said softly. "It is about moving forward even when you are afraid. It is about protecting those you care for even when it is hard. And sometimes, it is about trusting someone you do not yet know if you believe they can see you for who you are." The officer seemed to reflect on her words. He did not respond immediately, but she could feel the weight of them in the silence between them. It was clear that he was considering not just her courage, but the choices he would make regarding her future. One afternoon, the officer brought a small piece of paper and handed it to her. "Write something," he said. "Tell me a story about your people, about your life. Show me what matters to you." The young woman hesitated, but then she took the paper and began to write carefully. She wrote about her village, about the friendships she had formed, about the lessons learned from elders and family. She wrote about the day she had been captured, about her fear, but also about her hope that one day understanding could replace conflict. When she finished, she handed the paper back. The officer read it slowly, nodding occasionally, and then set it aside. As days turned into a week, a subtle bond began to form between them. It was not friendship in the usual sense, for there was a clear barrier between a soldier and a prisoner. Yet there was mutual respect. He respected her strength, her intelligence, and her humanity. She respected his willingness to listen, to question, and to see her as more than a captive. Each visit became a lesson in understanding, not just of words, but of character and values. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the officer stayed longer than usual. He looked at her with a mixture of thoughtfulness and concern. "You have faced much," he said, "and yet you remain strong. Most people would not endure what you have. I need to decide what is right, not just what is expected. That is not easy." The young woman remained silent, sensing the weight of his words. She did not know what he would decide, and for the first time since her capture, she felt both fear and hope. The chains still bit into her wrists, but her mind was alive with possibilities. She wondered if the officer might choose mercy, if he might see her not as an enemy, but as a person deserving of freedom. She also wondered if she could trust that hope. That night she lay on the hard floor, thinking about her life, her people, and the strange path that had led her here. She thought about the stories her grandmother had told her, stories of unexpected kindness, of choices that could change the course of life, even in the darkest moments. She understood that her survival depended not only on courage, but also on understanding the hearts of those around her. And for the first time, she sensed that the officer might possess a heart capable of compassion, a heart that could make a choice that defied expectation. As sleep finally claimed her, she dreamt of her village, the wide open skies, the flowing rivers, the laughter of her friends, and the warmth of her family. She dreamt of freedom, but also of the delicate balance between hope and caution. She knew that the coming days would decide her fate, and that every action, every word, every glance mattered. And as the night stretched on, she made a quiet promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would remain true to who she was, and she would face whatever came next with courage, intelligence, and dignity. The days that followed were filled with quiet reflection and careful observation. She watched the soldiers move about the fort, noting routines and behaviors. She continued to speak with the officer whenever he visited, sharing small pieces of her world, pieces that revealed her intelligence and humanity. Slowly, she began to understand that he was not a man of blind authority. He was a man who weighed decisions carefully, who understood the value of mercy, and who could see the difference between duty and justice. And in this understanding, a fragile but growing hope took root. She began to imagine a future beyond the chains, a future where courage and understanding could triumph over fear and expectation. It was a hope that would guide her through the days to come, a hope that would prepare her for the moment when the officer would finally make a choice that could alter the course of both their lives forever. The days continued slowly at the fort, yet for the young Apache woman, each day felt heavier than the last. She remained bound by chains, yet the conversations with the officer had begun to change the way she saw her captivity. She had learned to read his expressions, the slight movements of his hands, the way his eyes lingered when she spoke with honesty. And she realized something remarkable. He was thinking, not just following orders, not just enforcing rules, but thinking deeply about what was right. It was during one of these quiet mornings that the officer asked her to speak more about her life before capture. "Tell me about a day you remember vividly," he requested, his voice calm and patient. She took a deep breath, recalling a memory that had shaped her courage. She described the early mornings when she would rise before the sun, helping her family gather water from the river. She told him about the way she and other children would explore the hills, learning the language of the land, the sounds of the wind through the grasses, the tracks of animals in the soil, and the signs that warned of storms. As she spoke, she noticed the officer leaning forward slightly, listening with a level of attention that surprised her. It was not just politeness or duty, it was genuine interest. She continued, telling him of the teachings she had received from her elders, lessons in patience, in courage, in observing the world carefully before acting. "We learn to respect life in every form," she explained softly. "Even when facing danger, even when we are afraid, we are taught to think, to act with understanding." The officer nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words had struck him. "You have lived a life very different from mine," he said, "and yet your values, they are strong. They are something to admire." She paused, studying his expression. It was the first time she had heard something like praise, spoken not with mockery but with sincerity. It made her think that perhaps, despite the chains, her words could reach him in ways that actions alone could not. Perhaps there was room for understanding, even between people from such different worlds. Over the next several days, the conversations deepened. They spoke about courage and fear, about responsibility and the consequences of decisions. The officer began asking questions that revealed not just curiosity about her life, but questions that weighed heavily on his conscience. "If I follow orders blindly," he asked one evening, "I will do what is expected, but will it be right?" She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "Doing what is right is not always the easiest path," she said gently. "Sometimes the right choice is the one others cannot understand." But if your heart tells you it is worth following." Her words seemed to linger in the air between them. For the first time, the young woman felt a shift, not in her chains but in the possibilities surrounding her. She realized that she had an influence over his thoughts, that her courage and honesty could affect the course of his decisions. And with this realization came a cautious hope, tempered by the understanding that one misstep could destroy everything she had endured. One morning, the officer arrived with a different approach. He did not bring questions or stories. Instead, he simply sat and watched, as if observing her as part of a larger, unspoken experiment in understanding. She could sense that he was thinking deeply, weighing his options carefully. Finally, he spoke. "You have survived much, and yet you remain true to yourself. I must make a decision about you. It is not simple, and it may not please everyone, but I want to consider it carefully. I want to understand what is just, not merely what is expected." The young woman remained silent, letting his words sink in. She felt her heart race. This was the moment she had been waiting for, though she did not yet know what choice he would make. She understood that he had a power she did not, but she also realized that he was a man capable of thought, capable of seeing beyond the rigid rules that governed so many others. The officer returned several times over the next few days, bringing small gestures of kindness, a cup of water, a blanket, a quiet word of encouragement. Each gesture reminded her that his decision was not yet final, but that he was leaning toward consideration rather than simple enforcement. She began to feel a fragile hope growing, even as she kept her guard. Hope, she had learned, must always be balanced with caution. One afternoon, he asked her to speak about her dreams. "What do you hope for?" he asked gently. She paused, thinking carefully. "I hope for peace for my people," she said finally. "I hope that we can live without fear, without the constant shadow of conflict. I hope that we can teach our children to be strong, to be wise, and to respect life. And I hope that one day, even people from different worlds can see each other not as enemies, but as humans with similar hearts." The officer was silent for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the weight of her words. Then he spoke slowly, almost to himself. "Perhaps it is possible," he said. "Perhaps understanding can exist, even in the midst of conflict. Perhaps mercy is not weakness but a strength." The young woman listened, sensing a shift in the air. For the first time, she felt that her fate might not be sealed by the expectations of others, by the rigid rules that governed soldiers and captives alike. She began to imagine a life beyond the chains, a life where courage, understanding, and mercy could shape the future. The officer's behavior over the next week reinforced her growing hope. He questioned the actions of his colleagues, reflected on the consequences of rigid obedience, and seemed increasingly conflicted about the conventional path for prisoners. He did not speak of punishment or threats. Instead, he spoke of choices, of fairness, and of what it truly meant to act justly. Each conversation strengthened the young woman's belief that he might act differently, that he might defy expectation and choose something remarkable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the fort, he entered her cell with an unusual calm. He did not sit immediately. Instead, he walked slowly, observing her quietly before finally speaking. "I have been thinking," he said, "about duty, about right and wrong, and about the people I serve. You have taught me something important, that courage is not just about fighting, but about standing true to oneself. That mercy is not weakness, but strength. And that understanding can exist where most see only conflict." The young woman felt her heart beat faster. She did not know what he would decide, but she realized that he had already changed. His thoughts were no longer guided solely by orders or protocol. They were guided by consideration, by empathy, by a recognition of her humanity. He continued, "I have to make a decision about you. It is not easy, and it may not be understood by others. But I want to choose what is right, not what is expected. I need to consider carefully, and I will act in a way that honors courage and honesty rather than fear and power." The young woman remained silent, letting his words wash over her. She understood that the moment of decision was near. She also understood that she had played a role in shaping his thoughts, not by pleading or begging, but by showing strength, honesty, and resilience. She realized that her courage, her dignity, and her humanity had reached him, influencing a man who had the power to change her fate. As night fell, she lay on the hard floor of her cell, reflecting on the conversations, the lessons, and the subtle changes she had witnessed in the officer. She felt a strange mixture of fear and hope, the tension of uncertainty balanced by the knowledge that her courage had not gone unnoticed. And as she drifted into sleep, she understood that the coming days would bring a choice that would not only define her future but also reveal the depth of mercy and understanding possible even in the harshest circumstances. The dawn broke slowly over the fort, the sunlight spilling across the dusty ground, painting the walls of the buildings in soft gold. The young Apache woman awoke with a mixture of hope and fear. She had sensed a change in the officer over the past days, but the question of her fate still lingered heavily in her mind. Would he follow the expected path, sending her to confinement or worse? Or would he make a decision guided by something rarer, empathy, understanding, and mercy? The officer appeared mid-morning, his usual calm demeanor carrying an unusual seriousness. He did not speak immediately. He simply studied her, his eyes thoughtful. The young woman noticed the weight of his decision reflected in the way he moved, in the careful pauses before he spoke. She could sense that today was not just another day of conversation. It was the day a choice would be made. "I have thought carefully," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "about what is right. Not what is easy, not what others might expect, but what is just. I have listened to your stories, observed your courage, and considered your words, and I have come to a decision." Her heart pounded in her chest. She remained seated on the hard floor, chains clinking softly as she adjusted her posture. She did not speak, for words felt too fragile, too small to hold the weight of this moment. She waited, her eyes fixed on him, silently asking for mercy without daring to hope too much. The officer stepped closer, holding a key in his hand. He knelt slightly and carefully unlocked the chains that had bound her wrists for so many days. As the metal fell away, she flexed her hand slowly, feeling the freedom of movement that she had not known in over a week. Relief washed over her, but she held her composure. She had learned through every trial that dignity mattered as much as freedom. "You are free," he said simply. "I have decided that keeping you here would not be just. Your courage, your honesty, and your strength are not crimes. I will not allow them to be punished unfairly." The young woman's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of disbelief and cautious gratitude reflecting in them. She had expected harsh words, strict orders, perhaps even anger. She had not expected mercy. She did not speak immediately, unsure if words could truly capture the depth of what she felt. Instead, she lowered her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the profound choice he had made. He continued, offering her a small bundle of supplies, water, dried food, and a rough map indicating a safe path through the desert. "These will help you reach your people," he said. "I cannot accompany you, but I want you to have a chance to return safely. Use these well and travel carefully." The young woman accepted the supplies, feeling a new kind of hope stirring in her chest. She thought of her tribe, her family, and the friends she had left behind. For the first time in days, she imagined walking freely across the land she loved, returning to those who awaited her, and sharing the story of courage and understanding that had just unfolded. Why would you do this?" she asked finally, her voice soft but steady. "Others might see you as weak or even foolish for letting me go." The officer looked at her thoughtfully. "Strength is not always measured by punishment or control," he said. "Sometimes the strongest action is mercy." Sometimes the bravest choice is to see someone's humanity, even when the world expects otherwise. You have reminded me of that. The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She realized that this moment was more than freedom. It was a lesson in human nature, a reminder that choices guided by fairness and empathy could change lives in ways that force never could. She thought of her people and how they would see her return. The story of her courage and of this man's mercy would be carried in whispers and songs, a story of hope amidst hardship. As the day wore on, preparations for her departure continued quietly. The officer ensured that the guards understood her release, though he did not explain his reasoning. Some looked surprised, others skeptical, but no one questioned him openly. It was clear that his decision would stand, regardless of whether others understood it. Before she left, he approached her one final time. "Remember what you have taught me," he said. "Courage, honesty, and mercy are stronger than fear and cruelty. Take that with you and share it with others." The young woman bowed her head slightly, feeling a deep respect for the man who had chosen to act differently than expected. "I will," she said, "and I will not forget what you have done for me." With the chains removed and her supplies in hand, she stepped out of the fort carefully, taking in the sight of the wide-open desert stretching before her. The sun was high, warming her face and casting long shadows across the dusty ground. For the first time in days, she felt the wind on her skin, the sun on her shoulders, and the freedom to choose her own path. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of captivity lifting with each step. As she walked, she thought of her tribe and the stories she would tell. She would recount not only her survival, but also the unexpected kindness of a man who saw her courage and chose justice over expectation. She understood that her life had been saved not just by his decision, but by the trust she had shown in remaining true to herself, by the honesty and strength she had demonstrated even when the world had tried to bind her. The journey back to her people was long and difficult, yet she faced it with renewed determination. She navigated the hills and rivers carefully, relying on her knowledge of the land and the guidance provided by the officer's map. Each step brought her closer to the village she loved, and with every step, she carried the lesson of mercy and understanding with her. Along the way, she encountered challenges: a river swollen from recent rains, rocky paths that tested her balance, and the constant awareness that danger could be near. Yet she moved with confidence, guided by both her skills and the quiet strength instilled in her by the officer's act of kindness. She realized that courage was not only about facing enemies, but also about moving forward despite uncertainty, relying on knowledge, patience, and hope. At night, she rested under the stars, thinking of the officer and the choice he had made. She felt gratitude, not only for her freedom, but for the reminder that people could act with fairness even when others might not understand. She knew that this moment would remain with her forever, a beacon of light in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. Finally, after several days of travel, she approached the outskirts of her village. The familiar shapes of homes, the smoke rising from cooking fires, and the sounds of life filled her heart with joy. Her people noticed her approach and ran to meet her, their faces a mixture of concern and relief. When she recounted her journey, they listened in awe, not only at her bravery but at the story of mercy she had experienced. The young woman's return became a story in itself. Her courage and survival were celebrated, but so too was the lesson she brought, that even in the midst of conflict, understanding and compassion could exist. The officer's unexpected decision had saved her life, yes, but it had also shown her people that humanity could prevail even in difficult circumstances. As she sat among her family that evening, sharing her story, she realized that her life had been changed forever. She had faced fear, captivity, and uncertainty, yet she had emerged not only alive but strengthened by the experience. She understood the power of choices, how one person's courage to act rightly could alter the lives of many. And she carried with her a renewed belief in humanity, a belief that would guide her actions and inspire her people for years to come. The young Apache woman returned to her village under the wide, open sky, the sunlight reflecting off the hills and valleys she had known since childhood. Each step she took brought a mixture of relief, pride, and wonder. She had survived captivity, she had endured fear, and she had witnessed something extraordinary, a choice made not out of fear or duty, but out of understanding and compassion. That choice, made by the officer who had once held the key to her chains, had changed her life forever. As she neared the center of the village, she could see her people gathering, their faces marked with worry and hope. Children ran toward her, calling her name, and elders rose from their seats, their eyes wide with curiosity and cautious relief. Her family rushed forward, embracing her tightly. Tears and laughter mingled as she returned to the warmth of those she loved. She had feared that she might never see them again, that the world of the fort and the harshness of captivity would take everything from her. But here she was, safe and whole. Once the initial excitement settled, she began to tell her story. She spoke of the ambush, of the journey to the fort, and of the days spent in chains. She recounted the conversations she had with the officer, his careful questions, his patience, and most importantly, his decision to show mercy. The village listened in awe. Many could not imagine such a choice being made by a soldier, someone who had every reason to follow orders without question. But as she described his actions, they realized that courage could exist in unexpected places. That strength was not always measured by weapons or force, but by fairness and understanding. Her story quickly became more than a tale of survival. It became a lesson for her people. They marveled at her bravery and at the officer's choice, understanding that the world was not always as simple as right and wrong, enemy and friend. Life, they saw, was filled with moments where understanding and empathy could bridge gaps that seemed impossible. The young woman had lived one of those moments, and she carried its lesson with her, like a spark that could ignite hope in others. Days passed, and life gradually returned to normal in the village. Yet the story of the officer and his mercy continued to be told. Children listened wide-eyed as elders recounted the events, emphasizing the courage and honesty of the young woman and the uncommon kindness of a man who had acted differently than expected. The young woman herself often reflected on what had happened, thinking about the choices that shaped life and the lessons that came from them. She realized that true courage was not only about surviving, but also about recognizing the humanity in others, even when circumstances encouraged cruelty or fear. She also thought about the officer. She wondered how his life had been affected by his decision. Would he face criticism from his peers? Would he regret choosing mercy over authority? She hoped not. She hoped that he had learned something as well, that fairness, understanding, and compassion could make a difference, even in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. She knew that her own actions, her honesty, her courage, her willingness to share her story, had influenced him. In this, she found a quiet satisfaction, knowing that change could ripple outward from even the smallest of acts. The young woman resumed her daily routines, gathering water, helping her family, teaching children, and walking the hills that had always been her home. Yet, she carried with her a new understanding of the wider world. She knew that the conflict between settlers and her people would continue, that dangers would arise, and that hardships were inevitable. But she also knew that acts of courage and kindness could leave lasting marks, shaping lives in ways that were not immediately visible but profoundly important. Months later, she shared her story more formally with the village elders. They listened intently, asking questions and reflecting on the lessons embedded in her experience. They spoke of honor, responsibility, and the importance of recognizing humanity in every individual. The The young woman realized that her tale was no longer only about herself or about the officer. It was about the values that could guide her people through times of conflict. It was about showing courage, practicing empathy, and making choices that honored life rather than merely following orders or fear. In the evenings, she often walked to the edge of the hills, watching the sun set over the land that had shaped her. She thought about the fort, about the chains, and about the officer who had chosen a path that few would have expected. She understood that his decision had been difficult. It had required him to act against expectation, to follow his sense of justice rather than the simplicity of rules. And yet, he had done it. He had chosen mercy. He had chosen understanding. The young woman reflected on the nature of power and responsibility. She realized that power was not only about control or strength. It was also about the ability to choose wisely, to act with fairness, and to recognize the humanity in others. She understood that each person, regardless of position or circumstance, had the opportunity to make choices that could change lives, that could transform fear into hope, and that could inspire courage in ways that would endure far beyond the moment. She also thought about herself, about the courage it had taken to remain true to her values, even when she was afraid. She knew that her survival had depended not only on the officer's mercy, but on her ability to remain honest, brave, and resilient. She had spoken carefully, acted wisely, and preserved her dignity, even when chains bound her wrists and fear threatened her heart. In this, she saw a reflection of the very values she had learned from her elders, and she understood that they had guided her not only to survival, but to the opportunity to teach others about courage, mercy, and the complexity of life. As the seasons changed, the young woman continued to share her experiences, emphasizing the lessons she had learned. She taught the children about the importance of courage and honesty, about the value of observing the world carefully and thinking before acting. She shared stories of her journey, of the challenges she had faced, and of the mercy she had received. And she spoke of the officer, not as an enemy or a stranger, but as a man who had chosen justice over expectation, compassion over strict rules. Through her teachings, her people began to see the ripple effect of choices. They understood that courage could inspire, that honesty could influence, and that mercy could leave a lasting impact even in the midst of conflict. The young woman's story became part of the oral history of the village, passed down from generation to generation, not only as a tale of survival, but as a lesson in values, in understanding, and in the power of human choice. Years later, she would look back on her captivity not only as a period of fear and uncertainty, but also as a time of profound learning. She understood that life often presented challenges that tested not only strength but wisdom, courage, and compassion. She recognized that her experience had taught her about the complexity of human nature, about the possibility of mercy where none seemed likely, and about the enduring power of choices guided by justice and understanding. The officer's unexpected decision remained a touchstone in her memory. She often wondered if he too reflected on that choice, if he remembered the young Apache woman who had taught him that mercy could be stronger than fear, and that courage could exist even in moments of uncertainty. She hoped that he had learned, as she had, that true strength came from understanding, fairness, and the ability to see beyond the immediate demands of duty or expectation. In the end, the young Apache woman's life continued, shaped not only by her tribe and her traditions, but also by the extraordinary experiences she had endured. She remained brave, wise, and compassionate, guiding her people and teaching the next generation about courage, mercy, and the power of human choice. And she carried within her the lasting lesson that even in the harshest circumstances, acts of understanding and empathy could transform lives, leaving a legacy far greater than any chains or conflict could impose. Her story became more than personal survival. It became a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, the transformative power of mercy, and the courage it takes to act rightly in a world filled with challenges. And through her teachings, her people learned that even in the face of fear, hope and humanity could shine brightly, guiding lives for generations to come.